Welcome to the Democratic Club of Wicomico County. Tonight we have immigration experts Tim Dunn and Amy Lieberman here to talk about the immigration crisis in America.
They might, at least some of them might, yeah. So let's see if I can make the technology work here. Since I work here, I should be able to do that. Right? You'd think, wouldn't you?
Don't jinx yourself.
All right. I've even taught in this classroom. I'm an immigration scholar, and I've written a couple books on border enforcement and immigration and human rights issues, and several other publications as well, but that's kind of my specialty. I've done some research in collaboration with my spouse, in part, on immigration adjustment, immigrant adjustment, Spanish-speaking Latino immigrant adjustment in this region as well. So looking at kind of interior resettlement and how do communities adapt and how do the immigrants adapt. Okay, look at U.S. immigration today. Just to start off with, about 42 million people. 11 million are undocumented. Everybody wants to talk about the undocumented, people who are here without permission, and you know, a large portion of whom come with visas but then overstay. Not everybody enters illegally by any means. But you know, it's about between 25 and 30% who are here illegally. So it's really a minority of the immigrant population, but that's the part that gets all the attention. But it is important, but it's important to realize it's a much broader group. Where are they? Where are they from? Mostly from Latin America, about 50%, about a quarter from Asia. Mexico is the single largest sending country, about 25%. Then the Central American nations, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, particularly our next big countries, Dominican Republic in the Caribbean, Cuba in the Caribbean as well. These are the bulk of where people are from. Not so much from South America, but some. And in Asia, it's principally, the big ones are, it's more diverse. I mean, Mexico is kind of the 800-pound gorilla here, numbers-wise. But in China, it's more spread, or pardon me, in Asia, it's more spread out. It's China and India and the Philippines, and we have a lot of Korean immigrants here as well, for instance, and various from Southeast Asia, particularly as a legacy of the wars there, Vietnam and Cambodia and so on. So it's a very diverse mix today. It's not what it was 100 years ago, which was principally from Europe. And what do the numbers look like? Kind of the limits that the U.S. kind of has. An annual limit, and Congress can adjust this from year to year, but the annual limit is about 675,000 for permanent resident immigrants coming in. Then there are some exceptions for spouses and immediate family members like minor children and so on. They get roughly about 1 million a year coming in. Then there are about 3 million a year who have temporary work visas. 3 million. Right? Now, most of that is family members. A good portion of that are the workers, but they also, and depending on the visa, are allowed to bring family members. Some are, some aren't. And then the refugees, which have gotten the big attention, the travel ban just got struck down. It's focused on them. About 80,000 a year. It ranges anywhere from 60 to 120,000, usually between 60 and 100. There was, the Obama administration tried to raise it quite a bit in their last year. So it's really, this is kind of what you're looking at here. Yes, sir.
The percentage is 50% Latin America. Does
Yep.
that represent the 42 million, the 11 million, or?
50% of the total, of 42 of the 42 million. Of the undocumented, that's more about 75 to 80% from Latin America. About half of whom are from Mexico. 50%. Mexican numbers have gone down actually since 2008. There's a net negative outflow. Undocumented population is down since 2008, since the recession as well, down from 12 to 11 million. And the Mexican portion is also down. We're at a net negative, but it's still the biggest portion. Central Americans and the Caribbeans make up another roughly 25%. So about 75% of the undocumented are from nearby Latin American nations. Yes, sir?
How long is temporary?
There's a lot of different programs. Some are here very briefly, and some are here quite long. It depends on the program. The H-1B visa workers coming as highly skilled workers often will be here for quite a length of time, multiple years. It depends, again, on the sponsor and the terms they get and so on. Immigration law is very complex. There's many, many different categories. We get the summer workers over here in Ocean City from Europe. They're very short term, like 3-4 months.
Well, when it ends, how do they then get the position to go back? Is it up to the employer to say, okay, you have to, if you leave, who monitors that?
The exit process is not well monitored. That's been one of the complaints. We're dealing with so many millions of people, it's hard to keep it. Yeah, some people overstay. Some employers are but the visa is held by the employer, right? So you don't come for an industry, you come for an employer. And if the employer doesn't like what the worker's doing, they have great leverage over them. And they will say, you do what we say or we're putting you on the bus back to the airport tomorrow. You'll be back in Mexico in 24 hours, we guarantee. So some employers are very direct about that. Some less so. Don't have quite as much control. The lower skilled workers are more vulnerable. And a lot of these are seasonal agricultural workers as well, and they're temporary. There's no limit on agricultural workers, but that program historically has been very poorly run, very bureaucratic. Recently, it's gotten a lot more expanded, and we'll look a little bit at that. There's a tremendous increase in legal temporary worker visas for particularly agricultural workers in the last, really since the late Bush administration.
Is that program still available where if someone is a wealthy person in the Mideast and will invest several $100,000 in the United States, they're given
I believe it's called the entrepreneur investor category. Yes, it is. They started off, you had to plop down $1 million. I believe they lowered it to $500,000. So yes, you can get a visa. You can buy your visa if you can afford it. Yeah. But there's, talk to your local immigration attorney. Man, there's a lot of ins and outs there. And then the last thing there I was kind of looking at was the number of children, U.S.-born children, citizen children born with at least one parent who is undocumented. So, by 2012, the estimates, and the numbers I'm getting here are mostly from the Pew Research Center. They have a really great Hispanic research center. Their numbers are really quite in line with most of the Department of Homeland Security numbers too. There's pretty good consensus because they all use some of the same scholars to arrive at their estimates. They rate about 4.5 million in 2012. We're probably up closer to 5 million by now. So there's a lot of people live in what we call mixed status households where at least one person is undocumented. Others may be citizens, others may have visas, may even have U.S. citizen spouses. I mean, there's a lot of cases now of people facing deportation who have U.S. citizen spouses. Used to be if you had a U.S. citizen spouse, you could get regularized pretty quickly. They changed the law in the 1990s, made it much, much harder. So if you came here illegally and then married someone or overstayed a visa and that your status went, you went out of status as it were, it's really hard to regularize your status now. It costs many thousands of dollars and sometimes it's still not possible. So it's you have this really bizarre situation of U.S. citizen spouses can't legalize their immediate significant other. So there's a lot of tension and fear in households where if anyone has tenuous legal status, even people all have visas, those visas can be pulled, right? Even permanent resident visas can be lost for as little as, DUI convictions. And other even more minor offenses. They really tightened up the laws in the 1990s to make those visas much harder to hang on to. And the authorities have great amount of discretion. So people have a lot of fear. And in this kind of political climate, as you can imagine, much, much more so. And just a little bit of history or background. Just notice on the one side the great kind of ups and downs in U.S. immigration population since, the 19th century onwards. There's a big dip after the early 20th century. This is the percentage of the population that's immigrant was about almost 15 in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And then it went down by the mid-20th century because the laws changed. We basically closed the door. It was like virtually open borders till 1924, except for Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and a few other then kind of gradual restrictions were added. About 99% of the people who went through Ellis Island, for instance, got entrance. Only 1% were turned back. I mean, you had to be a pretty sorry case to get turned back.
Or sick.
But they had a hospital on the grounds where they allowed people to try to get well. I mean, so they were very accommodated in some ways. But 1924, anti-immigrant sentiment is kind of like it is now. Really got very hostile, and the rhetoric was so racist, it would make Donald Trump and his minions blush. You know, I mean, it was very in that for its time. You know, it was fit with the time, so to speak. But boy, looking back, it's quite striking. And it was directed at people today we think of as white, but we're not considered as such then. You know, a lot of Eastern Europeans, a lot of Southern Europeans, Central Europeans, the Irish, God forbid, English certainly didn't consider them white. You know, there were all sorts of different groups from Europe whose descendants we think of as very white that were not at that time. There's a lot of extreme racism directed against them.
And also religious too.
And a lot of it was religious-based, right? Jews, Catholics, etc. Yeah. And so the laws were opened up post-1965 they kind of opened things back up and granted a lot of visas on the basis of family reunification and skills. So after 1965, you see this big increase. And we're right at about today where we were 100 years ago. Right? It's a high immigration period. And when you have a high immigration period, you usually have more hostile climate at times, particularly during times of economic downturn. When there's an economic downturn, you can kind of set your watch by it. You're going to see an anti-immigrant backlash because they're going to get scapegoated for the economic problems, whether they have anything to do with them or not. Right? And there just has been a lot of unauthorized migration in this same more modern period because there was a large temporary labor migration program from Mexico during the middle 20th century. From 42 to 64, it had upwards of 500,000 Mexicans a year coming to work in agriculture, and that visa program was abruptly ended. And the demand for their labor still persisted, so people came to work. And it was not illegal to hire them.
What I was going to say too was somebody we don't really talk about. The government gets the blame, but corporations have
Bingo.
Well, you know, a lot of the pull of the U.S. is the labor market. People come because there's jobs, and employers. It has become illegal to hire people who are here without status since the laws were changed in the late 80s. The Immigration Reform and Control Act in '86 was implemented through '88. But the enforcement of that toward employers' has been pretty lax, and they're very rarely fined. In many years, like almost no cases were ever prosecuted. So all the enforcement gets directed at the workers. But we also kind of have to keep in mind, why do workers and people generally come? Sending conditions, they're kind of pushed to come here by their sending country conditions. A lot of them don't want to have to leave. But they face extreme violence, warfare, repression, drug gang violence. In the case of Central America, Honduras and El Salvador have the highest murder rates in the world, outside of war zones. And there's extreme conditions, or just more often economic lack of economic opportunities and certain hardships. And people come for better opportunities, and they know they can get jobs here. So that's kind of how it's historically gone. And if you look, before we get to Trump, I just want to point out where has public opinion been on this issue, particularly regarding the undocumented, right? That large group that gets the most attention, but is really only a minority of all immigrants. Since 2006, 2007, Gallup has been polling, what do you think ought to be done with illegal immigrants, as they term it? Media organizations now stop using that term, but that's still the commonly used term in popular culture. The percent that remain in the U.S. and become citizens if they meet certain requirements over time, basically legalization and a path to citizenship, has not varied. It stayed right around in the mid-60s to the high 50s since 2007, 2015. The most recent poll, after all this drum beating of the presidential campaign in the last year and the winning candidate making that one of its signature issues, 6 in 10, CBS poll released last month, 6 in 10 Americans think illegal immigrants currently living should be allowed to stay and apply for citizenship. Another 13% think they should be permitted to stay but not apply for citizenship. So really, 75, 80% are consistently over time say they should be able to stay, and most say apply for citizenship if they meet certain conditions. Only, around 15%, the light green at the bottom, the kind of medium green, they're the ones that say deport them all. That's the Trump line, right? It's like, how does he get so much political mileage out of something that doesn't really poll that well? It is quite striking. But on a lot of immigration issues, my kind of understanding over time I've developed is there's not a lot of knowledge out there about it, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of ignorance, and a lot of bad stereotypes promoted by the media and others, and political officials of all stripes and pundits. A lot of misinformation. The scholarly research is just not consulted at all. But boy, doesn't matter how misinformed or lack of information people have, they are passionate. So there's a lot of passion, but the knowledge is about this deep for a lot of us, so which is very unfortunate. Okay, what's Trump doing? Of course, the banning the refugees. As you know, in this issue, court case just struck this down, right? But the revised from 7 to 6 Muslim majority nations. You see who they are. Maryland's one of the states that was challenging this. Hawaii, Washington, other states. I'll just hold the darn thing. And then a pause from all countries for 120 days, right? So this is not just the 7 countries, but they modified it so they let in legal permanent residents and people who already have visas, but there's still a ban. That would be an indefinite ban from those countries, 6 countries. All the other countries would be just refugees. And only temporary, but it would be 160 days, or 120 days, pardon me.
How does that affect, like Ocean City summer workers from Europe?
Well, they're not refugees.
No,
They're
I understand that.
Yeah. This shouldn't have, the Trump administration has yet to come out with guidelines about what are they, they talked about the refugees, they've talked about the wall, they haven't talked about temporary workers. Foreign workers coming for temporary employment. I assume that he's kind of talked about it with regard, but he hasn't issued any guidelines yet with regard to H-1B, the more highly skilled, highly educated people in the tech industry and in scientific fields and in education and medical sciences often. Those highly valued people by a lot of companies and universities. He's talked about we got to look at that because there are American workers that have been displaced by some of the H-1B workers. And there are problems with, I would say, the high-skilled end of the visa process is where there have been some real abuses, and it hasn't been well run. There are some issues to look at. But, I don't know. We'll see what he comes out with. He hasn't issued any guidelines yet.
The main program used in Ocean City would be the J-1.
The J-1, yeah.
Which is for the college students. Do
Correct.
you think he would adjust that at all? I mean, the low-skilled college kids my age.
Yeah. That's probably a low priority. It's nothing I ever heard him mention in the campaign or was on his website about immigration. But it certainly could be. I mean, if it depends who's whispering in his ears and that kind of thing. But, this is where employers have to kind of step up and as they are in the tech industry, it's saying, hey, we really need these visas. But it seems like I would guess that would be a low priority, but hey, the guy's full of surprises. Who knows, right? But that's a good question.
I have a quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
The people who are helping our troops and such with translating and things like that when we're in other countries, they often were granted some form of a visa to come over, after doing all that. I'm sure they've irritated most of the people in that area. Where do they fall in all of this?
Well, that was a big issue. Translators and others who helped troops in Iraq, Iraq was included on the list, and they got, in the first version of this, they got taken off in the second version because the Iraqi government said, hey, we are still working together here. You have, what do we have, like 6,000 U.S. troops in Iraq right now helping the fight against ISIS. And he said, look, if we're going to be collaborating and we're working together on this common problem here, you got to give us a little respect. And people who have applied for refugee status and so on should get a hearing. And so the Trump administration did back off on Iraq.
Okay.
Afghanistan is the other obvious country where this would take place. They are not on the list. They were not on the list, right? And the other country that may be of interest now is Syria, since we have about 600 troops in Syria, and they're going to ramp that up to something more than that now. But Syria is very high on the list of countries they're concerned about. So in the future, I don't know. Those cases, they did say they would make some exceptions on a case-by-case basis. They left themselves a little wiggle room.
As of right now, translators from Afghanistan are banned from entering the country. As of this week, the Trump administration handed down an order cutting them out too.
Wow. Wow.
So, yeah, translators don't get it.
Wow. Yes, sir.
Question here. Of the folks who stay, who come over illegally, do you have a handle on the number that jump the fence as opposed to the number who overstay their visas?
It's very hard to get an estimate of that issue of like how many. The question is how many people overstay their visas versus how many people enter illegally in the first place. Because it's a clandestine population, out of status, it's really hard to measure all this kind of stuff. But the best estimates by DHS, Homeland Security, and others, independent of them, have been about, depending on the region of the country you're looking at, varies quite a bit. Like this is much more common in New York, say, than in Los Angeles, because Los Angeles is much closer to Mexico. But the guess is anywhere from 25 to 40% are visa overstayers. So the majority are illegal entrants, but it's still it's more than a lot of people would guess in terms of visa overstayers.
Do the underground railroads pretty much still exist with the Coyotes running folks?
Yeah, there's a smuggling service. It's gotten a lot harder to get in. The one thing that Trump campaign has really made a living on is talking about how the borders, and many politicians, not just the Trump administration, people have been saying this for years. Douglas Massey, the primary immigration scholar in the U.S. on Mexican immigration to the U.S., has been running a survey in Mexico and in the U.S. among immigrant communities for 30 years, has the best data set of anybody ever, and shows that a lot of U.S. immigration policies have failed in the survey data he has. What he has said is that why does this narrative keep getting such traction? He says there's three places this comes from. Bureaucrats that are the head of things like the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection want bigger budgets, so it's in their interest to portray the immigration issue as out of control. I mean, this has been said since I was a teenager in the 70s. The border's been out of control. Immigration, we're being invaded. Right? This narrative's been going on, every couple of years for decades. So it's the heads of these agencies want more money. Politicians get a lot of votes by beating up on immigrants, looking tough on crime, and especially looking tough on illegal people. So-called, and then pundits and media folks of various types want to look relevant and gain viewership and get clicks, and the more kind of outlandish you get, the more kind of clicks you get. So you get a lot of people promoting this, and Lou Dobbs made a career on this on CNN for a long time, right? Until he finally got kicked off, but he's on another network now doing the same darn thing. There's just a lot of people out there doing that make a living off this, and this narrative keeps circulating and is very current. So, Massey talks about the data for people coming. We survey immigrants and their families and stuff. You find that almost everyone uses a coyote now or a smuggler because it's gotten so much harder to get in. And we've put up 650 miles of fencing on a 2,000-mile border. Donald wants to put up a 30-foot wall of concrete. That will be an amazing engineering and construction achievement if they get any significant part of that done, because that's such a massive structure. They're taking bids this spring. They hope to have something for a prototype in place by the end of the spring to begin building as prototypes in several sections. But Massey's pointed out what all this extra Border Patrol enforcement and walls and surveillance equipment tend to do, make it harder to come. More people die. 7,500 people have died in the border trying to come in illegally since the mid-'90s when this kind of really kicked off and expanded border enforcement. So it's been very bipartisan expansion. But people, once they get in, they tend to stay. Used to be Mexicans were very circular. Come and work for a while, go back. Now, because it's so much harder to come, when you get in, you stay. And eventually you try to bring your family up. And so the undocumented population has gone from 3 million in the early 90s to mid-90s to 11 million today. Right? It's like, he goes, look, the wall doesn't keep people out. It keeps people in. Now, in recent years, what's happened is there's been a big drop-off the amount of people caught at the border has gone way, way down to levels not seen since it's gone down 60 to 70%, from around 1 million a year to between 350 to 450,000 a year. So, a huge 60, 70% drop-off. And that is in part response to dropping birth rates in Mexico. The economy here hasn't had such strong labor demand. It's gotten much harder to come. All sorts of reasons people kind of stop coming as much. But, it just goes on. You get this narrative that things are just totally out of control. And yet the numbers are way, way down. The other thing that's happened is the number of temporary worker visas has gone, for Mexican workers, has gone from about, in 2005, it was about 50,000. Right? By the end of the Bush administration, it was pushing 200,000. The Bush administration expanded it. Obama administration, it went up to almost 700,000. Right? So we've had so people don't want to come illegally. If they could get a visa, they're much happier to come that way. The visa program was greatly expanded under Obama. Starting in Bush, though, but into Obama as well. We don't know what Trump's going to do with that. That's a really good question. Much of that is agricultural workers. I suspect they'll leave that part alone. But about half of it's not. So we'll see. So you have a big expansion in visas and a big drop in apprehensions at the border. The border's less chaotic and more policed and fewer people crossing illegally than any time in the last 40 years. But listen to political rhetoric, you'd never know it. Yeah. Okay. A couple more things on what Trump's up to. The 30-foot wall. By the way, this is some construction of, you can see the concrete there. They already have sections that are made out of concrete. Now, most of it is made out of fencing of various metal types. But there are sections in South Texas that are made out of concrete. And as you can see, these workers, that's pretty darn tall. That's maybe not 30 feet, but that's a good-sized wall. That's what, of course, they want to put a lot more in. The cost estimates for Trump's wall are anywhere from $10 to $35 billion. I suspect it'll be a lot more than that, given the amount of concrete we're talking about here. I would imagine you'd got to get closer to that. Yeah.
Because you have to have your superstructure to hold up, the metal to hold it up, and the supports and stuff like that.
And you got to build roads to all of it to get in, and it's going to be. We'll see. And then, by the way, speaking of the travel bans, there's an interesting kind of information put out since the travel bans were floated. Where have the countries of origin of people who have committed terrorist attacks in the United States versus, what are the travel ban countries? Right? The travel ban countries are all in blue. The countries in red and the states in red are all where different attacks were perpetrated. None of the travel ban countries overlap with attacking countries, or people from countries at one point either came as infants and lived here for a long time, or were children of immigrants and so on from other regions. In southern Russia, the Tsarnaev brothers, the Boston Marathon bombers. It's just there's no correlation here even. It's and the biggest country that's committed attacks against us was 9/11 was Saudi Arabia.
Right. Oh, yeah.
They're not on the travel ban list. Yeah, there are hotels there.
Real quick question. What about the status of people in U.S. colonies? And I use that word purposely. Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands. Are they allowed to freely travel to the United States?
Yes. Yeah. There's no travel restriction. Yeah. If they're U.S. territories, they're U.S.
Quasi-citizens.
Yeah, subjects or whatever. I'm not sure what the category would be.
They're citizens.
Puerto Ricans are citizens. I don't know if people of Guam are.
There's various.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I raised that question.
It's okay.
No, it's different. It's a little bit different than Puerto Ricans.
Yeah, I wanted to get through just a couple more things that Trump's up to, because this is what's sowing a lot of fear out there, is expanding detention and deportation procedures, ending so-called catch and release, because they don't have enough detention capacity to hold the 200,000 to 300,000 people a year that they are catching. The apprehension statistics are events, not people. So one person may be apprehended more than once. So if you have 400,000 apprehensions, the estimates are that's probably about a 2-to-1 ratio, about 200,000 people. At any rate, there's nowhere to detain all these people that much unless you build a lot of new prisons. And so, but they're saying we're going to start detaining more people, and the private prisons are, very happy about this.
Oh, they're delighted.
They think they're going to get, and there may be some other measures taken as well. They want to deport a lot more people, and they're saying, oh, we're going after criminal aliens. I just want to point out the Obama administration and continuing a program begun by the Bush administration. Because immigration policy is very bipartisan. It's not specific to one party or the other, really. But Obama, continuing a Bush program, really accelerated. He deported about 400,000 people a year through 2014, and then they finally dialed it down to focus more on serious criminal offenders. The majority of people they deported each year, even though they said every year, they said, oh, we're going after the bad guys. And they didn't say bad hombres, but it was the same kind of, oh, we're getting the criminals. Well, technically, anybody who enters the country illegally is a criminal, right? But they say, oh, we're going after criminals, we're going after people who have committed serious crimes. It turns out only a minority were serious offenders, violent offenders or other serious crimes. Almost all of them were either their only offense was they were here illegally, or they had minor traffic offenses, or other misdemeanor offenses. Right? Yeah, so-called identity theft. I'm really hoping somebody's got my Social Security number and is paying in, by the way. By the way, unauthorized immigrants pay in an estimated $12 billion a year to Social Security. And at any rate, there's a great deal of expansion where they say they're going after criminal offenders, but they're going after a lot more people than that. And there's been a lot of reports already of people who have only offenses here that they're here illegally, and they had some kind of temporary permission, but they just had to check in periodically with the authorities and get renewed. They've been grabbed. So the administration, as all administrations have tended to do, have kind of cloaked this in, hey, we're going to only go after the real serious criminals, but they're not. And they have spoken more freely, like, hey, the shackles are off. ICE and DHS, go, anybody, and they have said, look, anybody in the country illegally, we could grab. And certainly legally they can, but they've kind of reduced the prioritization and just kind of said, go for it, grab whoever you want. And that's what's really scared people. Twice. who's of course a citizen. Okay. And then, these other things are, prosecuting parents who use smugglers to bring their kids in, which is kind of a necessity. You have to use a smuggler to get your kid in if you don't have a visa. But certainly some parents have done that. Hire more agents, use local police more. This is where the Maryland law comes in of to limit the use of local police, because that tends to undermine the trust that immigrants have in the local police and hurts their willingness to report crimes and serve as witnesses and so on. So a lot of police agencies where they have a lot of immigrant population don't like to collaborate on immigration enforcement because they need that trust to work with those communities. And they certainly considered mobilizing the National Guard for 100,000 troops, but they floated that, but then said, no, we're not going to do it. But that gives you an idea of some of the kind of the horizons they're thinking of. And finally, they want to go after sanctuary cities, cutting federal funding, but there's a lot of obstacles to that. And there's a lot of differences of what that term even means. And for the time, the big thing they have kind of left alone is they're not going after the DACA kids. The people who came here as young students were Obama's legalization program, temporary status program for people who came under age 16 and got a high school diploma or served in the military and had clean criminal background and so on. You could apply for a temporary legal status, and they have left that alone. They know that that's like political dynamite. That group's been really active about advocating for themselves. They're most politically sympathetic of all the groups, younger people and so on, who have really grown up in America and are very Americanized. And they're called the Dreamers, the American Dream. And so they've decided not to go after them. They have started to pick off a few who have started to criticize the policies, but they haven't ended the program. So we'll see what they decide to do. If they end this program, that's a good political barometer of all bets are off. There's going to be a massive roundup. But it doesn't look like that is the case at the moment. But, with these guys, who knows?
What about foreign exchange students?
Foreign exchange students? The foreign exchange students are largely not touched by these provisions of any type, any of the provisions outlined so far. And the universities really want them to keep coming because they like having the foreign students here. They often pay out-of-state tuition. They like that, and they also like just having the cosmopolitan sort of diversity, all the cultural exchange that goes on, and so on. It's healthy for universities and communities. And the universities are seeing a drop-off in applications from foreign students this year because of this kind of general political climate. But there are no policies in place or proposed yet that are targeting them. I don't think the Trump administration is really very concerned about that.
The lower, like high school.
Oh, okay, high school students. Again, I don't think those programs will be much affected. I don't think that's what the Trump administration is concerned about. But it may discourage people from wanting to participate in them.
Tim, the government's talking out of both sides of its mouth.
Jeez, surprise.
I just got an email from the Office of Violence Against Women reminding me that, and all the domestic violence programs in the country, that it is illegal for us to discriminate against anyone because of their immigration status. And so we're being told basically that we need to take these families in at the same time that we're being told that the sheriff might want to come and see who's in my shelter.
Yeah, there's a famous case down in El Paso where a woman applying for a protective order against her abuser was apprehended by ICE as she came out of court. And ICE has been staking out the courtroom, the county court there, and picking people off as they come in.
It's happening everywhere. It's happening here.
Yeah.
Women apply for U visas because they are victims, and they're being taken out of courtrooms.
Wow, on the shore? Wow. Well, this is, I think this DOJ, the Office of Violence Against Women, might have one policy, but they're not driving the bus.
But this is Victims of Crime Assistance money, which is mandated. Every step of that law is mandated by Congress, and so the Congress says in the law that it is illegal to discriminate based on immigration status. At the same time that they're saying we're going to take them all out of here.
Yeah, you can maybe have some tension between the branches of government there. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I'll be quick because I know we're coming to the end of the meeting here. My name is Amy Liebman, and I work right here in Salisbury for a nonprofit, a national nonprofit called the Migrant Clinicians Network. And we are 30 years old, and our mission really is to be a force for justice for the mobile underserved. And essentially, we work with clinicians and service providers who are caring for immigrants and migrants. And largely, our work has been, even though we're based here in Salisbury with one of our offices, we're headquartered in Austin, Texas, our work has really been national. I've done a couple of projects locally, but because of what's happened recently with the change in administration, we have really been filling a gap and a very huge need in our community, because here in Salisbury, there really is not a lot of groups that are geared up to really help deal with the preparedness that immigrants need to do in order to deal with what's happening. So one of the things that we're trying to do locally is say, we know that our funding is for national programs. We're basically doing it on the side and trying to build a program and raise funds so that we can fill this really needed gap here, or not needed gap, but address the gap here in our community. So what we're doing is we've developed a train-the-trainer type curriculum where we're helping to get other service providers, but we've been doing it ourselves. Mostly my colleague, Alma Galvan, who works with me, has been the one who has been educating immigrants at church groups and all around. And each meeting that she does, we get more and more immigrants coming. But what we do is we spend a lot of time talking about what your rights are. We give out these little red cards. They're in great demand, but basically they say in English and Spanish, what their rights are should someone come to their house, that they don't have to let anyone in unless they have a specific search warrant. And so it just gives them the words to say. We spend a lot of time on stuff that you would do that you wouldn't ever want to do if you were a parent. We talk about what are you going to do in terms of custody of your children. Don't forget the mixed household that Tim talked about, where we have a lot of U.S. citizen kids and a lot of parents who don't have status. And so what are they going to do? So we talk about, there's power of attorney, setting up guardian arrangements, and in many cases, there are parents that are thinking about handing over the custody of their kids to other people so that their kids will not be endangered. That's something, by the way, that happened in Nazi Germany, where parents basically had to give their kids away or arrange custody for their kids should something happen. And then there's just basic stuff like phone numbers. We're also doing things like some education, basically how to not get noticed, no drunk driving, making sure that your kids are buckled in their seats in their car, just some very basic tips that seem obvious that we don't think about, but how to not draw attention to yourself. And then we've also spent a lot of time because kids in our community, families in our community, are facing discrimination and harassment. So we're doing some really kind of like nuts and bolts, what to do if you are harassed. And that's a piece of the program that we really want to grow and develop. We really want to look at how to help folks address the mental health needs. There's so much more that needs to get done, but right now we're kind of like in crisis mode and really helping them to think about what to do to prepare for the emergency. So a lot of times we're getting asked, we want to help, what can you do? So I just wanted to finish up our immigration talk and think about what it is that we can do as a community. And the first thing that we can do is what we're doing tonight is learning about immigration. It's an incredibly complex issue, and I think Tim just highlighted some of the basic complexities, but learning about it, reading about it, and discussing it is something that's really critical if we're going to make change in terms of the policy. And one thing I do want to stress, there's a lot of nuances, and we hear the term illegal alien, but I just want to remind folks that we try not to use the term illegal alien or someone's illegal because no human being is illegal. So we use unauthorized, lack of status. There's different ways to talk about it, but the important thing is we want to remember that we're talking about human beings, we're talking about families, we're talking about parents, and we're talking about their kids, and that's going to be critical if we're going to change how people think about immigration. And I can't stress enough the importance of learning and the importance of education. So this up here is probably kind of hard to see, but this was question 4, the referendum that we had in Maryland, that was about providing in-state tuition to the Dreamers. And so there was a lot of work that got done. And here at Salisbury University, there was a social justice group of students with a lot of kids that were actually Dreamers themselves. And they knocked on 3,000 doors. And what I think is incredible when we look at sort of the votes for Trump in Wicomico County versus the findings from this is that Wicomico County actually supported the Maryland version of that DREAM Act for in-state tuition. And I think it did have a lot to do with the knocking on the 3,000 doors and really educating our community, because that surprised me, in Somerset County as well. So that made me really proud of our little community here. But what it shows me is I think that immigration is complicated. Immigration is bipartisan, and it does take a lot of education and a lot of conversation. Connect to the immigrant community. Find out who's doing work with immigrants in this community. We're Migrant Clinicians Network, we've been here for years. I love doing local work. I've done some local work, but we really haven't done much, like I said. Now we're picking up the pieces. But there are some other groups. There's a great group. There's a Chesapeake Cultural Center in Easton. There's the Seton Center down in Princess Anne. In Georgetown, there's at Esperanza. So there's some groups that are helping immigrants, but we're few, and we're not necessarily funded to sort of do the local work.
When you say clinicians, what kind of personnel are you talking? Social workers, what?
So And my group, Migrant Clinicians Network, defines a clinician very broadly. We define it as the clinician who is taking care of the healthcare needs, to the social worker, to the community health worker. So we look at it pretty broadly, but by and large, we're largely dealing with the clinicians. And just one note I want to say, speaking of clinicians, I'll go off topic for a second, is that the immigrant countries that are on the ban list, there's a lot of clinicians that are providing primary care, particularly in rural areas and throughout the U.S. And there was a recent study that was out that basically 14 million patient visits are provided by doctors who come from the banned countries. So let's just put that in context. If we don't have folks from those countries, we're particularly in rural areas, we're really going to feel it. Pardon me? CASA of Maryland is another group that does a lot of work, and they're so overwhelmed with the DC kind of Baltimore corridor that we actually we wanted to call them and talk about some of the stuff that we're doing, and they were just overwhelmed. And I'm going to put the photos I have throughout here. We did a project a couple of years ago where we photographed immigrants throughout the Eastern Shore, and we did an installation at the SU Art Gallery just to basically talk about the contributions that immigrants make. This woman here is from Brazil, and she's holding a picture of her 2 kids who she hasn't seen in 6 years. And she talks to them through Skype, but she's here because she's sending money back to her parents in Brazil. The other thing is, and I think this group knows this, but calling legislatures, that's the best way to reach them. But when we have immigration things, the calls become very important. And then another thing that not everyone is comfortable, but I think it is something that we need to think about, is learning how to intervene as a bystander. And there's been some great stuff on the internet. This woman produced a really good comic about what to do if you're witnessing Islamophobic harassment. And then what we did, in fact, Alma basically paid for it out of her pocket because we felt like she wanted to use the same artwork from that woman, but the woman didn't want to make it. She didn't want us to change her art, so we just did something completely different with the same idea, so that was culturally appropriate for our Latino immigrants, and then also we're translating it. It's in Spanish and in Creole, but it's really like what to do if you're harassed, and basically how to de-escalate the situation. And this is something that if we observe it going on in stores or restaurants, that we can think about helping out. Another thing to do, and I think is really important, is to patronize immigrant businesses. We have a lot of immigrant businesses right here in our community. There's a wonderful store right behind the old Giant, or where Acme is now. La Mixteca. There's the many Mexican restaurants. There's businesses that employ immigrants. So I think that's another important statement. The Mediterranean Grill, the Greek Pita, they're all owned by immigrants. And another aspect that we need to think about is the dialogue that we have within the faith community. When it comes to immigration, the churches and synagogues are really important places that take very strong religious-based stands on immigration and abuse of immigrants. And so it's really important to continue the dialogue. And there's a lot of different resources for various denominations, from Quakers to Methodists to the Jews that have done some really good work. But Unitarians, just everyone. I think there's every religion we can look at, or every part of religion. There's been some really good curriculum and good work that's being done within them. And lastly, this is a plea to think about donating to the groups that are working with immigrants. There's information about Migrant Clinicians Network if you're interested in donating to MCN, because we really do need help locally. And our website is migrantclinician.org, and it pops up. You can donate right there. But also, I don't want to come here and just say MCN needs money, because there's groups like the Seton Center, there's groups like the Chesapeake Cultural Center that are all struggling, and and really kind of overwhelmed trying to meet our mission, which we're to be a force for health justice for the mobile underserved. We take that very seriously, and we need to, regardless of what our funding is, we need to help immigrants. And so we're all sort of overwhelmed and struggling and trying to do our best. So it's a plea not just for my organization, but for groups that are trying to help immigrants. So I don't know if you have any questions for me.
What about the children of immigrants that get deported? Are you working with families to help them understand what they need to do to make sure that their children are protected and cared for?
Absolutely, and that's what we're talking about with this idea of power of attorney, making the custody arrangements and doing the preparation. We're doing it twofold. We're doing it like pretty technically, like what is it that you need to have in place to do the power of attorney, and then but the other piece of that is the emotional and the mental health part of that, because what does it mean when kids go to school and they think that they're not going to have their parents waiting for them when they get home? So there's a much bigger piece than that sort of like technical, like get a power of attorney, do the legal work. There's this true fear that people are living in, and how to help them deal with that is the bigger piece that needs to get done. That I don't feel we're trying, but I don't feel like we're doing a good job, because how do you really do a good job with that? And in terms of the local law enforcement, I think that we're not quite sure right now. I have heard some pretty positive things in terms of maybe not so desire. Maybe there isn't a local desire to sort of do the 287G program.
Yeah, which is the enlisting of local police, kind of deputizing them to do immigration.
But there is work to be done with our local officials in terms of the education that is needed, in terms of what we can do at a city and at a county level in terms of addressing the needs of the people that are part of our community.
But if that Trust Act passes, it makes our state a free state. And then that would address that issue where local law enforcement would not be consigned to be part of ICE, is that correct? That's the way I read it.
It looks like state personnel. It's not clear to me that it includes local personnel. It is. I have a slide with the provisions of that. Let me pull that up real quickly.
So you're saying like state troopers?
Exactly. Yeah, and also anybody, universities, hospitals, anybody that's getting a sizable piece of state funding has to keep immigrant data confidential and not turn it over unless immigration authorities have a warrant. And they're trying to keep people out of hospitals, immigration enforcement away from hospitals and schools and courts, particularly. I have a slide with the provisions of that bill. I'll try to pull that up in a second. But that's the Trust Act thing. And so it's sort of like limiting some of the cooperation, but it doesn't by any means pull it all off the table.
And I need you to pull it up.
And generally communities have, this comes under the realm of kind of sanctuary idea of communities, and which is defined different ways in different places, but it's generally taken to mean that they're not going to turn people over to ICE for minor offenses or for arrests without convictions, right? At least if it depends on the community, if it's an arrest for a serious violent offense or nonviolent offense. But if someone's convicted, then they're like, okay, they turn them over. But if they're not convicted, they don't. And if they're and those are only for like certain categories, usually violent offenders, turned over. But lower level offenders, nonviolent offenders, not. But again, it depends. It depends on the cities and the places where how that gets defined. It varies quite a bit. This is kind of a move in that direction. The police commissioner of Baltimore has spoken out very strongly in favor of this. Yeah. Here it is.
Baltimore City has spoken out very strongly. Matter of fact, they have Hispanics outreach.
Yeah, there's some of the provisions of the act, right? And one of the interestingly, and this happens in many places around the country. It's very interesting. is that the African American political leaders often take a leading voice in speaking on behalf of protection for the rights of immigrants, which there's a certain logic to that. But on the other hand, in many places around the country, there are also tensions between Latinos and other groups of all types, including African Americans. And but in legislative circles, in many states, it's often the case African Americans work closely with Latino groups to help get certain protections. And that is the case in Maryland here as well. They're one of the leading groups, the Black Caucus of Maryland, Legislative Black Caucus.
Just to hypothesize on her point, and correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't say anything about local in that, so I would assume that means specifically that the state would not do any of that, but it's not necessarily stopping local governments from using their own public budgets?
I don't know how they're going to sort that out. That's a good question, because almost all municipalities receive state funding. Right, they're getting state funds.
They have
for
two
these.
separate budgets. They have what they get from the state, and then they have
Right.
their own budget.
Yeah, I don't know how they're going to sort this out. I'm not sure what the provisions of the bill are exactly in terms of affecting locals only kind of things. But that's, I guess, more will be known if this just goes forward. But the fact that the Baltimore police commissioner was speaking out so aggressively on this makes me think it might at least give moral support for local communities that want to kind of move in that direction.
Baltimore County has already said it too. Matter of fact, all officers, I was on the committee 10 years ago, carry a card in Spanish stating who they are, what they are. They're not going to arrest them. They want to help.
Yeah, and Montgomery County and Prince George's County are already sanctuary counties in the on law enforcement stuff, and Howard County is debating it.
Yeah, they've always been.
But not Anne Arundel. No, Anne Arundel's gone the other way.
Anne Arundel has a Republican chief executive.
Yeah, they specifically spoke out like a month ago, like saying, "Hey, we're going to help out." Yeah.
Just to remind you, the sheriff is an elected position in Wycomico County.
Good point.
If you could think of a candidate, let us know.
The sheriff is keeping his mouth shut on this right now.
But I'm serious. It is. I mean, we've had a couple people who thought of running and didn't. But boy, it'd be great to have somebody run against.
And there are more Democrats in this county than there are Republicans.
So yeah, there are various ways. I mean, just having an active community that's kind of informed and wants to put pressure on local officials, and stand up for people locally and collaborate with organizations locally, makes a big difference in people's day-to-day lives in schools and healthcare settings, and in the community generally, in places of worship everywhere. And so just being willing to lend a helping hand in whatever way you feel like makes a difference. So it doesn't have to all happen at the federal level, right? Or even in the state level. There are things that are done locally, and we just see people in our communities.
Public schools do a lot too. Don't forget them.
Yeah.
Schools do not know if the children have parents that are illegal. They don't know that.
Right.
They don't want to know.
No, but I'm saying like ESOL
Yeah,
classes and stuff like that.
there's a lot of work that can be done locally in terms, again, there's just a lot of ignorance, there's a lot of education that's needed, and we have in our school systems lots of U.S. citizen kids of undocumented parents. It's part, our kids play soccer with them, our kids go to school with them, and then at SU we have a number of DACA students here, so they're all throughout our community, and again, a lot more work needs to be done in terms of the education. Even things like we still ask for Social Security numbers when we register our kids in kindergarten. That's a barrier for some people.
And I just want to point out there is some effort to put together a meeting of people who want to work on immigration issues. A Lutheran pastor from Worcester County is putting together something with Unitarians here and others, just trying to put together a group of people. Anybody who's interested, on the 20th at 2 o'clock at the Unitarian Fellowship in Salisbury on Old Ocean City Road, just pull people together and start thinking about what can be done in our area. And the Lutheran pastor has been directed to do this kind of by his denomination and his Senate, and saying, hey, this is a moral issue for us. given the policies of their denomination, we should be they feel like they should be active, and certainly that's others as well. But it's very, open. It's not limited to any particular group.
I want to thank you for what you did tonight at the training over there.
Thank you very much for viewing. If you have any interest in these and other democratic issues, please go to the Democratic Club of Wicomico County Facebook page and come to our next meeting. Thank you, and God bless you all.